AI for Law Enforcement, an Innovate US workshop series brought to you in partnership with the state of New Jersey, the AI Center of Excellence for Justice, Public Safety, and Security, and the Rutgers Miller Center on Policing and Community. My name is John Butler. I'm the Director of Criminal Justice Policy in the Office of the Governor at the state of New Jersey. It's so good to see many names in the chat already that I recognize from others of these sessions. This whole series is aimed to equip public safety professionals with the knowledge and tools to use artificial intelligence responsibly just to protect the public, reduce crime, and promote fairness. I'm thrilled to hand it over again to our speaker, Shirsagar, for today's session, Facial Recognition, Applications, Risks, and Limits. Mihir leads the Tech Policy Clinic at Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy, which he joined in 2019 to launch an innovative clinic giving students hands-on experience in policy process. Previously, he served in the New York Attorney General's Bureau of Internet and Technology as a civil prosecutor, where he led major consumer protection and technology cases, including one of the largest consumer payouts in state's history. He has also practiced at Cravath, Swaine, and Moore, and Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell, handling complex antitrust securities and commercial matters. Earlier in his career, Mihir was a policy analyst at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC, focusing on the civil liberties implications of emerging surveillance technologies. He's a graduate of Deep Springs College, earned his AB from Harvard College, and received his JD from Penn. Uh, Before turning it over to Mihir, let me say the session is going to be recorded, but only the presentation portion, not the Q&A. The final 15 minutes or so will be devoted for questions and answers. If you'd like, you can please drop your comments or questions in the chat, and I'll try to keep track of them and organize them for Mihir at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and really great to be back. I should say that even though the questions are not recorded, John had a wonderful question at the end of my last session on predictive policing that really sparked a way to write about this. And I know that it's been dropped in the chat, the link to the article that summarizes some of the things we talked about the last time. John, thank you for that great introduction to my work. I'm at Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy, and Princeton does this work that really thinks about how can you improve the relationship between digital technologies and society. And so this is where I come into this. And John, you mentioned the time that I worked at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, which is just dates my age, but I guess was over 25 years ago. And at the time when we talked about facial recognition technology, the the core takeaway most of the time was the stuff just doesn't work. Um, and really, what we're in is a world in which now facial recognition technology does work pretty well, and we'll talk through where it works and where it doesn't work. But really, to think about how do we use it appropriately? What are the kinds of cases when it can be used? What are the cases that it shouldn't be used? And how do we think about these kind of deployment questions through a holistic lens? So, what can the practical steps that agencies can take, in law enforcement agencies can take to evaluate systems and avoid the kind of errors that will be very costly in the long run? And so, with that, um, just a second. Um, can you hold on just a second? Uh, Hold on. Sorry.
No worries. Here we are waiting. Not at all problem.
All right. I realized that for some reason the slides that I had were overwritten. So this is how technology works for you. Um, but let me just go ahead and then just talk to you about what I was going to say, and then happy to take questions. Um, so the central thesis that I'm starting out with is that facial recognition works, and for the most part. But how do we then use it responsibly? So, why do we think about sort of when we use it and how do we use it responsibly? Is that improved accuracy can create some harder policy questions, not easier ones. And the question is, when the technology doesn't work, don't deploy it. When it does work, you need to think through what the deployment constraints are. And I had a nice image of the Louvre, which all of you are familiar with, I'm sure, from earlier this year, where they had expended a lot of money on building security, but what was the key problem was that the cameras were pointed the wrong way. And so even with all these massive investments in security, what you find is that if you're not thinking about your system as a whole, there can be holes in your system. And so when you're trying to say, how do you think about sort of when do you buy a technology? Um, when you buy it and you spend a lot of money buying you think of it as sort of this magic bullet that's going to solve your problems, but you're not really budgeting for the main work of maintaining and evaluating the system as a whole. So that includes all the way from cameras to thinking about training people to use it appropriately, to thinking about how you're going to use the inputs that come into your system. So there's a great study that I'd recommend to everyone, and we can share it later on. Is a National Academy study in January of 24. It was commissioned by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, and there was an independent expert committee that helped report on this. It was chaired by the former director at Princeton, Ed Felton, and they looked through the risk management framework that we need to have when we apply this new kind of technology. And they said to think about it in kind of two distinct ways, right? One is what are the performance issues that you need to pay attention to when thinking about whether to deploy this? And then think about what happens if some things go wrong. What are the misuse issues? Even when the tech works, what are the inadequate procedures, trainings, or restrictions? And trying to think through what are the kinds of uses that, if we do use facial recognition technology, it should be used, and then other places where it should be prohibited. So let me start out a little bit by just level setting on sort of where we are with facial recognition technology and why is it that we are seeing these kinds of improvements in them. So the first thing is that the three key developments to this. The first one is that there's basically a new way to learn about images that has really revolutionized how accurate these systems are. It's neural network, or they call using neural networks or deep learning, and they can extract features from faces with unprecedented precision. And a lot of these algorithms can get really high levels of accuracy under optimal conditions, right? This is a key variable, is sort of what conditions are you testing these images in. But it is a clear and obvious improvement over what has happened before. And so uh, the other feature that was kind of important to this change in the scope and scale of these technologies is that we have a comprehensive testing framework from NIST. And so there's a NIST vendor test that will go out and do independent evaluation of these systems. They establish performance benchmarks and they can create baselines for what state of the art means. And so you can think of looking to the NIST vendor test to evaluate the different kind of facial recognition products you might be thinking of getting. Um, but the other thing that has happened is that we've seen facial recognition technology being deployed in a number of areas, and we've learned some important lessons from them. And they're lessons from international experiences, such as in South Wales, in the UK, or in Detroit, where there was a series of wrongful arrests. And law enforcement agencies have learned about what can go wrong when these systems aren't built properly or aren't used properly. And those experiences can help us get to a better understanding of how to deploy them responsibly. So, how does you can think of facial recognition as depending on two aspects, right? One is what are the reference galleries? So, what are we searching against? And then, what are the probe images? So, what is it that we're searching for, right? Um, and what you see in terms of the reference galleries, so where do the faces that populate these databases come from? They come from driver's licenses. So a lot of states have driver's license photos. And then there are passport photographs if you're the federal government. And then you have arrest photographs, mugshots that go in and populate this. And so those are sort of government collected, and there are rules and regulations about how and when you can use those kinds of images. There is another source of images, and it's very controversial, is this company Clearview AI, which went out and scraped billions of photographs from various different places. And a lot of that data was scraped without consent. It violated the terms of service of the platform. And there's a lot of questions around whether Clearview AI had the legitimate authority to go out and use it. So there's this question about, what kinds of reference information should you use in your facial recognition tools? Um, and then what are the kind of probe images? So, what are the images that you might search? So, you can think of security cameras as being one place where you could get it, street cameras, but you're also seeing things, in various places from doorbell and home surveillance cameras, like Ring cameras and other home security systems. So, they can feed in a series of images. And so, uh, I just see actually a question coming in. Which I'll answer now briefly on the question of our how does it deal with different ethnicities, different demographics, and things like that. And the short answer is, it doesn't perform as well on smaller groups of populations. The more you subcategorize people, it might have challenges. But it's not that it doesn't work at all. And a lot of these databases, a lot of the NIST tests do test for demographics. And so you are seeing some improvements in its ability to recognize people of certain ethnicities. It's by no means perfect, but it is a problem that a lot of the vendors are working on and trying to address. And a uh, it's not a sort of inherently technical reason why they will have a hard time. It's a question of how many images are they trained on, where the image is coming from. Is that image set a representative set? But if you do get to smaller and smaller groups of people, then as a population as a whole, then you're not going to get as many representative samples to test from. So it is always going to be worse for people on the margin, and that's an important civil liberties concern to take into account when you're deploying it. But it is something that is tested for. All right. So hopefully that answered that question, but let me know if you have further questions. Great to do this interactively, especially again, I apologize for the lack of slides here. Um, so there are three different uses that we've come to get comfortable with facial recognition technology, and the first one is quite obvious, which is something like with your phone, right? A lot of people use Face ID to authenticate themselves to say this is who I am, and it's a one-to-one match, and it's whether it's access controls, whether it's airport fast lanes, clear if you're trying to run through the airport quickly. Um, and this is perhaps the least controversial use. Some people may have still some objections. Maybe you have to provide some other opportunity for people to opt out of it. But if you're authenticating, that presents less of an issue. And this is an area where people have got more and more comfortable over time using a biometric such as a face to do various kinds of actions. The second kind of place where you see it is in investigations. And so that's after crime has occurred, and you're looking for a specific subject, you're looking for missing persons, and you're really thinking about this looking back in time in a retrospective use of footage, and you're trying to see, where were people, who are the people there, and how can you appropriately identify the people who might be in an image, right? And that's really what we're going to focus on today because that's where a lot of the debate is. Um, there is a third use, which hopefully no one is contemplating here, but is the real-time monitoring and surveillance of public spaces, where you're really scanning everyone who comes through your system. You're proactively trying to identify them, and you might do it for any number of reasons. You might try to use it, say, in public protests. You could try to use it in transit systems. You could try to just use it in a variety of different places where you're doing real-time surveillance of places. It's continuous. It's indiscriminate. There's no individualized suspicion. You're just kind of blanketly going out and crawling through and seeing who's there. And that really is where the constitutional concerns are the very strongest and the most problematic category. And so, really, what I want to focus on is on this sort of what is the right risk framework for thinking about the use in the investigation context. When is it appropriate to use, and when is it not? Um, and there's a great risk framework that the National Academy study has. And I would develop it with three components to this question, right? So the first one is, what is the technical performance of the system? Then the second question is, what are the kind of legal analyses that you have to run through? And then the third is, what is the management structure you have around using this appropriately, right? So thinking about your capacity for management is equally important as looking through the technical features and looking through the legal points. And so what you see is, from the technical performance angle, you see that the National Academies says, does the technology work? What are the false positives, false negative rates? Does it perform differently for different groups? Um, and just to repeat what I said earlier, but the finding from the National Academies was that performance differentials have not been entirely eliminated, yeah, even in the most accurate existing algorithms. It does perform less well for individuals with certain kinds of phenotypes, race, ethnicity, gender, but those are improving, and we are likely to see gradual improvement over time. So in terms of the legal analysis, so once you've kind of identified, and for this, I'll get back to a checklist at the end, but you can say, okay, does it meet these technical performance requirements? You can look to the NIST standards. You can look to your own particular population to say, is this kind of technology, will it work where I want to deploy it? And then you switch over to the legal analysis. So once you've got a tool that may work, then you start to say, okay, when can I use it, right? What are the legal rules around when I can use it? And so if you think about uh, privacy, is the data collected with consent? Do you have appropriate retention policies? Do you have the rights, do you have the right way that you've collected that reference gallery that you're searching for? Is that something you've done appropriately, and are you testing that appropriately? Uh, and then in terms of where you collect this information from, are you worried about some of the deployment? This is in the surveillance context, say, um, does it chill free speech or assembly if you're using it in this way? That might be a good reason to limit the use of facial recognition technology. And then the Fourth Amendment applies, right, which says, when you're going out and running these probe images, is there some kind of individualized suspicion that allows you to then go out and identify who this person is? So this is a place in which, and I think courts have not resolved these questions yet fully, but I think this is an evolving area. But I think one of the things you can take away is that courts are sensitive to the fact that some of the alternatives are not great, right? So if you rely on people who are uh, eyewitness testimony, for example, is notoriously bad. And if you compare that against, say, using facial recognition technology, you may wind up with a more accurate outcome. And so courts are open to, I think, in the right situation, understanding how technology might improve the accuracy and improve the way in which you might become less discriminatory, if in fact that's your reasons for adopting it. So really, the third part, once you've gone through this hoop of saying, okay, it's something that seems to work technically, we're deploying it in the right context, we're prying it where we have individualized suspicion, we have good reasons for relying on this technology, we've got the appropriate consent to collect some of these images and run searches across these images. But I think this is the part that often doesn't get talked about at the same time, which is, what governance and capacity do we have to take advantage of the system? Do we have clear procedures for when and how to use these technologies? Do we have training for the operators to understand the capabilities and the limitations, right? Um, and then what is our long-term systems capacity to deal with this? So can you actually maintain this over time? And if you looked, again, going back to the Louvre example, right, that's something where that failed. They had the money, they had the budget, but they really weren't thinking about it as a system, and they weren't thinking about where in the system could it be broken, and what were the kind of routine maintenance operations and testing that they needed to do to keep this going over time. So you can think about all three one after the other, right? So you can say, okay, do we have a highly accurate system? Okay, we've got some demographic issues, but how do we think about to caution our use when that comes around? Are we using it in a constitutionally sound way, right? So we don't have something like what happened in Detroit, where there's some wide scale use of this without individualized suspicion. And can we sort of think about it in even if we had the perfect technology with the constitutional deployment, but we didn't have adequate procedures around it, you're going to come up with inevitable failures. So all three really must work together, right? So when you're looking at these things in detail, on the technical side, you can think about what the optimal conditions are for some of these images. The tests show it under optimal conditions, but performance degrades rapidly with poor lighting, low resolution, non-cooperative subjects, old, outdated reference photographs, obscured faces, extreme angles. So all those things pose real challenges. So, the key takeaway here is be careful. Performance in the lab does not travel that well to the field, right? And then, there are these false negative rates. It can vary by a factor of three. And so that's something that you have to think about in terms of the aggregate impact. Are you going to get false negative rates, the failure to match the person who is in the database, or false positive rates where you're incorrectly matching somebody who's not a suspect, right? And really, the thing to remember here is something which I'll call the denominator problem, and we'll get back to this in the legal section. But the more faces that you have in a database, the more potential false matches you have. Right? It's a simple math issue. But if you're going to have an error rate of 1% and you've got 100 photographs you're looking at, you're going to get one image. If you've got an error rate of 1% and you're looking at 10,000, you're going to have, you can do the math, but right, 1,000, right? So, how do you minimize the error rates depends a lot about how you select who's in your reference gallery. And so there are actually some NIST guidelines around how to test it and how to evaluate whether the vendors are appropriately using this. So this is critical. And then the database quality matters just as much as the algorithm. People often forget that, but it's not just this facial recognition algorithm that has 99%, but it's, are the photos current or are they old? Are they properly labeled? Are there errors? Is there some kind of quality process around it? And so those are sort of important data integrity questions to think about, right? And one of the problems, really is the issue with Clearview was that it went out and built a lot of data based on scraping all this information. So when you're thinking about procurement, don't just ask about algorithm accuracy. Ask about what the database sources, what are the quality, what are the verification procedures, And again, like I said, with predictive policing, if a vendor won't explain how they go about doing this or what their data sources are, or say it's proprietary, that should really be a red flag for you. Because you really should get access to this and get access and get some kind of way in which you might independently test some of these things. All right. Moving over to the legal side, you can think about sort of the constitutional framework. And the first kind of four questions you can walk through is to say, do you have some kind of individualized suspicion? Right. In traditional policing, we've accepted that if you've observed some kind of suspicious behavior, you can go out and investigate that person. You can't just kind of randomly stop anyone looking for somebody who might be having something suspicious. That's why we don't have general warrants, right? And so, you might ask this question, is this for a targeted investigation or is this some kind of mass surveillance? And so, for a targeted one, if you've got a specific crime, you've got surveillance footage of the suspect, and you're searching a database of wanted persons with outstanding warrants, one probe image, a defined suspect pool, that might be a situation where you have individualized surveillance. On the other hand, a situation where you've got real-time scanning across everyone, there's no specific crime, no specific subject, and you're just kind of looking around. That's your general surveillance, and that would be a real issue. Um, and then you can ask, what is um, really, what are you looking at in terms of the denominator? So you can have the same technology, same accuracy rate, but different constitutional implications based on just the scale it is. So when you're searching for 100 people, let's say you've got a post-crime investigation, you've got a footage of a violent crime, and then you're looking against a database of people with violent offenses. Maybe you'll get even if it's a 1% false positive rate, you'll get one false match. But on the other hand, if you're searching um, across a whole range of people, you could wind up with one false positive, still similar levels of accuracy, but then you get exponentially more false matches, and that then means a lot more people who have to interact and are wrongly suspicious. Held in suspicion, and that creates all kinds of legal risk for the deployment. And so one of the reasons, the National Academies points out, right, is as the size of the reference gallery or the rate of queries increases, the possibility of a false positive match grows, and there are many more potential templates that can return a higher similarity score to a probe face. And so when you're thinking about who's in your reference gallery and sort of incorporating everyone who's there, that can really wind up tagging a lot of people who should not be tagged. And so there are places where states have stepped in, and John knows this from New Jersey, but there's a restriction for when you can do facial recognition technology. You can limit it to serious crimes. It bans kind of exploratory searches. And it really forces department to treat facial recognition technology as a scarce, high-value resource. And that's one way to think about this, is trying to keep the false positive rates low and manageable so that this denominator question is kept in check. It's a similar issue in England, in South Wales. They were doing this kind of broad scanning of public spaces, and there was a court challenge around it, and then they reformed it to use strictly defined watch lists, and could only search for specific individuals um, with outstanding warrants, right? And this is a way to take a more narrow, careful approach to it. Then the last question you can think about here when you're applying this is, what's the time duration of the use of this technology? Is it time bound or is it continuous? So what might be acceptable if you think about it from a legal perspective, if there's a specific event, a specific time frame, maybe there's some credible threat intelligence about something. There's a clear start and end date, and then the system closes versus a permanent infrastructure with no termination point, and it's just continuously picking up information. And one of the things to acknowledge is very real, and you've all encountered this, I'm sure, is that there's this problem of mission creep, right? We start with one kind of crime, and then we say, well, why don't we'll start with terrorism, we'll expand it to violent crime, then why don't we do it with property crime, then why don't we just do it across the board. And without sort of legal constraints, this kind of technical expansion of what missions it might apply to is easy. Easy seems easy and hard for law enforcement to resist. And I think you really have to put in place strong safeguards from the start to prevent the kind of mission creep that otherwise would be inevitable. And so you can come and say, how do you sort of think about the legal restrictions from the start to bind yourself to a limited mission in which you can use this appropriately. Um, all right, so there is various the First Amendment activities that might be protected that you could use facial recognition on. There are places where some cities have tried to deploy this, for protests, for example, and that has been found to chill kind of lawful assembly and created some First Amendment hurdles. And so there are strong constitutional reasons why we have the ability to go out in public and not create suspicion. And so you can be careful about how you might do any kind of real-time deployment of facial recognition technology, because it both fails the Fourth Amendment, there's no individualized suspicion, and the First Amendment, it can chill lawful assembly. And so um, there is this, again, this National Academy study has a very clear indication about this and says, you got to limit law enforcement image collection to define public safety purposes, and that you should only use it to identify individuals suspected of engaging in criminal behavior. It's not a generalized monitoring of people without any kind of individualized suspicion. Okay. So then we get to this important question of managing your capacity and managing what the mission creep concern is. So, you know, you can start with sort of some questions, right? Saying, is there an important public interest that this kind of deploying this kind of technology enables that we wouldn't get otherwise? Not just would this be useful, but is this necessary and proportionate, right? What are we solving that we wouldn't solve otherwise? What are the costs and benefits? And have we tried to minimize the costs? Um, then the next question you might say is, are we using this technology only for the stated purpose? Um, that again, we've seen this again and again with any number of systems, right? Facial recognition is not the only one. You can think of license plate readers and a variety of other things where we've got to ensure that there are mechanisms to keep ensure that people are using it for the right kind of reason, and only for the reasons that we had accepted and agreed to. And then the thing that you have to think about, which in the mission creep angle is often again something people don't think about, right? Is that there's a fatigue for the analysts, for the people who have to do the day-to-day work. So as you find more false positives, and you really flood your investigators with thousands of low-quality leads. And so higher priority investigations get less attention. The system becomes effectively a noise generator and not a crime solver. And so there are very pragmatic reasons why you want to be very careful about what missions you use this for, because you're thinking about how to husband your resources and ensure that it's being used in the most effective way. And then there's some other factors that you should consider, right? Have you consulted with stakeholders in the community? Do they understand, how this technology will be used? What kind of guardrails are around it? And have you thought about sort of incorporating their feedback and thinking about that when you're thinking about where to deploy these kinds of systems, right? So that you do get community input. This is not just a system that law enforcement deploys without getting an understanding from the city council or other people about what these procurement decisions are. Because, the problem is that you can go out, buy the technology, deploy it, but if this butts up against community norms or people raise problems around it, it makes your job much harder, right? So trying to think about how to be proactive, anticipate the kinds of pushback that you might get from different communities, engage with that, and then use that to build a more effective deployment system. Because at the end of the day, you want to expend your resources on appropriate kinds of places. Um, so you can think of sort of taking in the community input, and then finally, thinking about the training and oversight, right? How do you get adequate training for the operators of these systems? Are they around? Can they mitigate kind of these systems risk? Understand where and when these different kinds of systems work, right? So you can take examples from, say, Detroit, which had multiple wrong arrests. There was some findings about it lacking proper procedures and training. They just treated a match as a probable cause for arrest. Didn't really do anything to independently verify this. And it really wound up with, there were some legal settlements. There's a lot of damage to community trust and national headlines. So if you want to try to avoid those kinds of situations, how do you think ahead of that? How do you really treat a match as something that's an investigative lead? It's not probable cause for arrest, but you find other ways that you are independently investigating it, and it's just treated as kind of a lead that you can then use. All right. Um, what are the kind of oversight mechanisms you need? You need audit trails, you need monitoring of the quality, and you need some, and as talked about it the last time with predictive policing, but you need accountability mechanisms, right? So how do people know that they've been tagged? How do they contest any kind of false matches? Is there regular reporting to oversight bodies? And is there some kind of public transparency around how and when these systems are being used? That's another way to think about keeping your mission creep problem in check. Is that if you had to deploy, if you had to identify all the times that you're using this technology, that can ensure that it's only being used in the highest value, most effective places. And so, when you're thinking about sort of the institutional capacities, to think about, do you have the people there? Um, and then have you budgeted for sort of the long-term costs? Can you maintain, the database quality? Do you have the legal review capacity to deal with this? And can you implement kind of the different verification procedures that you need to have to ensure that nobody's caught up in the system incorrectly? And then, to think about what happens when systems fail, right? So, one of my favorite ways to think about problems is that systems always fail. It's just inevitable. So you got to fail small. And to try to think about, well, what are the response procedures? How have we prepared for the system failing? And then do we have adequate ways in which you might respond? Okay, so really you can kind of think about it as what can happen is that a department can spend a lot of money buying technology from a vendor in the first phase, but then the technology sits kind of unused or gets misused, right? And then the system degrades without adequate maintenance, and then you get another vendor coming in saying, "Okay, I've got another solution," um, and you want to avoid that kind of cycle where the technology is used as a shiny new toy, doesn't really get you the results you want. You wind up not really using it, but now you spend a lot of money on a technology that you aren't being that effective with. How else can you spend this money? Trying to think about your system as a whole, trying to figure out where are the places where it might be more effective to use these different kinds of technologies. All right. So putting this all together, and then I'm happy to take questions. Uh, you can run through this checklist, right? So first, think about the technical performance. Does it meet the NIST standards? Are you comfortable with the demographic differentials? Are the image qualities appropriate? Are they optimal for the kinds of concerns you're looking at? Um, does the system communicate sort of confidence levels? Are you able to understand how effective these systems are? So if you find that it doesn't meet any of these standards, right, then that's a good reason to just sort of reject getting this technology. You need to understand that it is technically going to do the things that you want from it. Then you can switch to saying, okay, now I've got a thing that may work. What are the legal situations when I might deploy it? And so I should say my background is I'm a lawyer, so that's obviously where I think about these questions most closely. But it's to say, you know, is there individualized suspicion? How many people are we searching against? Are we doing this indefinitely or is it time limited? Will the use of this technology impact protected activity? And have we adequately consulted the community and got the community buy-in? Right. And so you can think of sort of some of the efforts in Massachusetts and New Jersey to deploy facial recognition technology responsibly is trying to fill into something like this, right? Um, and then you can think of this as the next gate that you're going through. So you've got something that's technically fine. Uh, you're deploying it in the right legal context. Then go ahead. If you find yourself deploying it in the wrong legal context, then that's a reason to stop. But then the last step is to say, do I have the individual, do I have the institutional capacity to address and take advantage to address the issues that inevitably crop up and take advantage of these systems. So, do we have the maintenance budgets? Do we have the right kind of procedures? Do we have the audit and accountability mechanisms? Do we have the thought through what our budget is, not just for the purchase price of the system, but for all the maintenance, training, and everything else that goes with it. So, think about building your capacity first, right, in some ways, before even going out to do this procurement process, because you need to think about whether you can deploy it effectively. You wouldn't be able to deploy it effectively if you didn't have the capacity. And so, in some ways, that's really worth thinking through first. Okay, so there are lots of examples from the National Academy study about best practices to think through when you're buying these systems. The my final thought, is to ask yourself, uh, technologies without systems inevitably fail. And so, how do you use them appropriately? How do you use them wisely and sparingly? Um, it isn't just about sort of deploying a bunch of technologies. Just like going back to the Louvre example, you can see having a technology is not enough. You have to maintain it. You have to use it appropriately. Properly designed systems are what stops crime from happening, and holds people accountable. And sort of relying just on technology will put you into a place where you will find yourself very quickly not getting the results you want. So it's a way to think through all these three things together: the technical features, the legal features, and then the institutional capacity features. Okay, so with that, let me stop and see if there are questions.
There are a lot.